So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For Westlake Porter's inaugural nonprofit happy hour, I am pleased to present Bethany and Chi-Chi of Enlightened Solutions as they present Getting to the Work, Allyship at Work and at Home. Bethany and Chi-Chi will discuss both personal and organizational allyship and how allies and advocates can do the work at home and bring it into the workplace to ignite change and connection. So, ladies, take it away.
Thank you. We're very excited to be here tonight. My name is Bethany Studenik. I am the co-founder and managing director of Enlightened Solutions. We're going to be talking a little bit about various different aspects of allyship and anti-racism work, particularly in the nonprofit sector. A little bit about me. I'm a licensed social worker. I have a background in counseling and individual advocacy. I also have a master's in social work and social administration, and I earned my Juris Doctor from the University of Akron. My experience really is rooted in advocacy work. Before I was the co-founder of Enlightened Solutions, I met Chi-Chi while working with the Department of Justice in the city of Cleveland on police reform efforts. I've been a lobbyist, I've been a fundraiser, and I've done things like direct practice with youth, survivors of domestic violence, children at risk of dropping out of the school system, and individuals with mental and physical limitations. I'm going to turn it over to my co-founder, Chinenya and Temera, to talk a little bit about her background.
Hi, my name is Chi-Chi or Chinenya. I am delighted to be here this afternoon. I am really excited to just talk about anti-racism work within nonprofits, but more so how we can implement these ideas and these solutions within our daily life. A little bit about myself. I'm from Northeast Ohio. I got my bachelor's from The Ohio State University in political science and African American studies. I co-founded, like Bethany said, Enlightened Solutions with her in 2018, and we are a workplace advocacy firm, and you'll learn a little bit more about that as we go on. I continue police reform work, working with the Black Shield Police Association, which is a Black fraternal police union here in Cleveland. I continuously do police reform work within the realm of crisis intervention. So a lot of these difficult conversations is where I like to, hone in my skills. And lastly, I was a Teach for America middle school teacher in Houston, Texas, and came back up here to teach kindergarten through third grade students reading intervention.
Awesome. So we're just going to start jumping right in. And first, something that we find is very useful to start with is definitions. Things that we will refer to throughout our presentation that we'd like everyone to kind of be on the same page on. So one of the things that we find very helpful to define is what is the difference between interpersonal racism and structural racism. A lot of times when we're having these conversations, individuals don't have a clearly defined working definition for each of these things. So first, let's start with individual racism. This is the attitudes, actions, and inaction of individuals that perpetuate and support racism. Individual racism can be deliberate or unconscious. So there can be those components where people are specifically targeting and espousing racist or problematic ideals, or there can be individuals who have kind of an unconscious bias and it's operating in a way that upholds racism or racist ideals, as well as potentially other issues at other identity intersections. So for example, it's jokes, epithets, avoidance, fear and acceptance, or collusion, that there's an inherent or moral superiority of culture, practices, ideas, history, or worldview. It's a good example here of calling a coworker by the name of someone else who shares the same intersection. What we're talking about here is, for example, say you're working on a team with a couple of individuals who are Latinx, and the majority of the team is white. Whenever you interact with one of the Latinx coworkers, you call them by the name of yet another Latinx individual member of your team. What's important there to understand is that whenever something like that happens, it's problematic because it really reduces people to their identities. It's essentially communicating that I really don't see you as an individual holistic person. I see you as a member of a group and I think about your group interchangeably. So an example like that is just one example of many, many, many ways in which individual interactions and interpersonal communication can go wrong and can be used to exclude and make people feel non-included in their environment. Structural racism can be a little bit harder for some people to begin with, but in the end, it makes a lot of sense. So structural racism is really about the normalization of race-based power dynamics that advantage white individuals and culture while compounding adverse outcomes for Black people and people of color. It inhabits all aspects of life, cannot be contained or identified in one industry or institution, which makes it the most pervasive type of racism. What we're really talking about here is, there's an individual person-to-person type of problematic communication, but structural racism is whenever systems have been designed to exclude intentionally or have not considered the needs of people with diverse identities. So for many organizations, this can be kind of hard to define because it looks a little bit different and functions a little bit different inside of each institution and organization. And again, inside healthcare systems, it might look different, significantly different than it might look in, say, policing, or it might look in education. So understanding that structural racism is something that can sometimes be a little nebulous, a little hard to define. It's important to keep looking for it. We have to realize that most of our structures that have been built in this country, in the United States, have really been built to accommodate people who have what we would call normal identities. And what I mean by that is the more white, the more male, the more heteronormative, the more cisgendered, the more neurotypical, the more you identify with those particular identities, the more structures are going to be amenable to your needs. Whereas the more you diverge from those identities, the more structures are going to be resistant to you and your needs and not really take them into consideration. So for example, Western holidays and cultural practices, music, clothing, hairstyles and textures, history, accolades, banking and political structures. Those are all areas where we can see and clearly define structural racism, but again, it's complex and so large. It can be hard for people to grasp whenever they're first coming into contact with this concept. A great example is redlining. Banks determine loan default and redline neighborhoods at high risk. These neighborhoods tend to be Black neighborhoods, and white neighborhoods were able to receive low housing loans. So something that's important to understand here is, if you haven't read up on redlining, essentially what happened was banks were delineating where they would make loans, and they made more loans and had better terms for white individuals buying in white neighborhoods. Whereas transversely, they would encourage Black families to go into neighborhoods that were primarily Black, and they would give loans in those areas or may not give loans in other areas. So if a Black family wanted to move into a white neighborhood, a bank might deny them a loan, whereas if they were moving into a Black neighborhood, a bank might allow the loan. And so this is something that really contributed to the makeup of our neighborhoods that we still see very, very much ingrained in our neighborhoods in Cleveland and in Northeast Ohio today. So we're going to talk a little bit about traditional diversity and inclusion efforts. I'm going to hand it over to Chi-Chi to talk and get us batted off here.
Awesome. So sometimes when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we like to keep it at its most base level, right? So it's just white and Black or male and female. But the current social movement that's dedicated to anti-racism or anti-homophobia or anti-misogyny is evidence that traditional diversity and inclusion work is just not working, and it won't work moving forward. We need to make sure that diversity and inclusion has substance towards it and isn't just a one-off statement that a CEO is stating to make sure that other people understand that they are accepting. And a little bit more about that on the next slide. So what we mean by performative actions when we're talking about diversity and inclusion is like that black box. So if you remember early in June, earlier this year, many companies from Nike to Victoria's Secret to Refinery 29, tons of really big name companies started putting black boxes on their social media accounts from Twitter to Instagram to Facebook. Organizations and individuals posted a variety of these types of boxes to illustrate anything from solidarity to acknowledgement of Black lives through the Black Lives Matter movement or anti-racism action. The issue with that is a lot of that performance was really, really performative. And what we are trying to make sure is that individuals and organizations are not expressing performative allyship. And what we mean by performative allyship is that it's more concerned with an individual or an organization's feelings than it is about challenging ingrained biases. So it's all about showing someone, I'm a good person online, as opposed to, I would like to rid our organization of structures that make it more difficult for diverse people to flourish within the walls of this organization. So
we can
go ahead. You can do the example.
Go ahead. So an example here that can be really helpful is thinking about our own nonprofits in the community. So this nonprofit is an example. It's imaginary, but we have definitely seen remnants of each of these kind of issues inside nonprofits that we work with. So our example here is that there's a nonprofit that serves a majority Black community with 70% of the agency's revenues coming from Medicaid, billing for services to Black individuals. So really doing a lot of work in the Black community. However, we see the board of directors is entirely white, the CEO is white, and the majority of all upper level staff are white. We can see that Black staff are concentrated in direct practice roles. So again, we really think that as this organization makes a formal post about dedication to supporting Black communities, although they are working in that community, it appears that work is not necessarily trickling into their internal workings. And what's really problematic here is that even if you are working internally, it's important to start communicating exactly what you're doing internally and how you are taking the next steps in righting the wrongs of the past. And when we're talking about this, we're really looking at, optically, it's very difficult to say, we support the Black community while at the same time saying, but we don't have the Black community in positions of power inside our organization. Decisions are not being made by the Black community. However, we are serving the Black community. And you can see where there's cognitive dissonance there. It's important to be aware of where those points are, where it can be very difficult. And it's important to acknowledge them so that individuals can know that you're working towards a solution.
So an issue with this particular nonprofit is that if you were to really peel back the layers, is that after a review of disciplinary actions within this nonprofit, we found that Black employees were being disciplined at double the rate of white employees. So despite the fact that the CEO of this organization and their managerial staff made a number of performance review decisions that had the effect of diminishing minority and Black talent within the organization. So even though that CEO made an inclusive statement, put a black box on social media, if we're peeling back those performative layers, if we're really looking at the root of what this organization is doing day to day in their practices, they are actually not supporting individuals that are marginalized. And therefore, you start to question if they are serving the best interests of their clients as they are forward facing into the community. So, how do we know if an organization is trafficking in performative behavior? Or even more internally, how do I know, myself, how do I know I'm not just putting up things on social media that's performative? There are 6 pretty easy ways to know if your post is performative. I'll do the first 3 and Bethany will round out the last. So the first one is that your post is simple and it doesn't share anything new. If you just put a post of a black box up there and it doesn't say anything, you may be thinking, or we may be looking at your post saying, this seems like it's pretty performative. It seems like you're trying to show something as opposed to teach an individual or teach yourself. Second, the post lacks any kind of next steps. The post is not illustrating any kind of policy changes, lobbying, ways that you can contact individuals, or any kind of general strategy for, if you're looking at an organization, strategy for employees, strategies for your clients, or strategies for individuals that may be purchasing the services that you are offering. Next, the post is simply soliciting praise or approval, and it leaves no room for nuance other than yes. So if you're looking at a post and all the people that are looking at it can say is yes, there's no kind of free exchange of ideas, there's no exchange of information, then your post may be performative.
Right. And to add on to that, thinking about signaling virtues without really challenging systems. So when I'm posting something and I'm thinking about, whether or not this is helpful or whether or not this moves the conversation forward, I'm really thinking about the substance of what I'm talking about rather than how it makes me look by sharing this type of information. And I think this really flows right into point number 5, expressing outrage or shock without offering tangible solutions. For a lot of individuals, I think this is a very natural reaction to new information. However, we have to keep in mind that from the perspective of someone who has been marginalized by these systems, it can be frustrating to hear individuals consistently, finding out this new information that someone else has been living all of their life. And while you might be outraged and you might be shocked, it's important to channel that into the next steps. And educating people who share your intersections can also be helpful, but they're going to have the same question that you have. How can I do something about this besides just feeling frustration, feeling outrage? Again, we're really looking at focusing on problems that are one instance rather than systemic problems. So for example, if you share a link that really focuses on, or say you read an article and it really focuses on individual or interpersonal issues. So say there was a teacher that made a racist comment or had a racist post online. That is one thing to talk about, but we have to understand that that is a member and that is something that happened inside of a larger system and structure. And it's important to acknowledge that larger systems and structures continue to enable these things to happen. So it's a little bit disingenuous to say, wow, look at this one particular teacher who said this particular thing, and not turn around and also look at the educational institutions that continue to ignore and downplay the issues that minority communities face while interacting with the educational system.
So how do we mitigate performativeness? We've taught you all about what performative allyship is and what performative social media posts are, but how do you actually stop this within your organization, and how do you stop this within your own personal or social life? First, organizations and individuals have to be prepared to do that kind of heavy lifting and encourage each other, your colleagues, to do the same. This is a lot of work that deals with internal introspection. So in your own personal circle, how are you leading a life that is open and welcome to diverse ideas, diverse individuals, diverse history? How are you doing that heavy lifting without burdening individuals of that kind of diversity? So if you are trying to learn about women's issues, are you sitting around and poking the brains of all of the women in your life? Or are you going online and doing independent research from feminist scholars or womanist scholars, or learning from women in general about any kind of topic that you're interested in? Next, my favorite. Organizations must not simply rely on the chief diversity specialist or the diversity and inclusion director. Although these are great titles, these are great positions for individuals to have, this should not be the only position worried about diversity and inclusion within the organization. Inclusiveness has to be within all ranks of all positions in any kind of organization that you're working in, whether it's a religious organization, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a business, whether it's your own consulting firm. You need to be able to understand that diversity and inclusion has to be at every single level, from your receptionist all the way to the chief executive. And that's how you are able to make these changes take root. Lastly, each employee, very similarly to the first, is responsible for supporting and fostering that kind of inclusive workplace every single day. So it's not just 1 or 2 trainings, it's making sure that you are waking up every day, going to work, and supporting your coworkers.
Absolutely. So Chi-Chi, just building off of what Chi-Chi's saying, how to mitigate performativeness. So it's important that you're listening to subject matter experts. And by that, we really mean when you're talking to someone who either knows about or is trained in diversity and inclusion or has lived experiences at particular intersections, it's really important to slow down and listen to their experience. We don't ask, and we really do not encourage you to ask people of color, people at different intersections, to be sharing their stories. And the reason, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the reason we're really talking about this is what we often see in organizations is that whenever there's a particular issue around a particular intersection, what a lot of people do is seek out someone that they know at that particular intersection and ask them for details. And a lot of times they're asking people to really talk about their own personal experiences and their own personal traumas in working inside of systems. And we really discourage you from doing that. It is not the responsibility of particularly Black employees, but people at all intersections to be your diversity and inclusion specialists simply because they inhabit those particular intersections. Black and minority consumers and employees are not responsible for educating about, dissecting, and dismantling structural racism. And what we really mean by that is we see a lot of organizations, and we will cover this in detail as well, but we see a lot of organizations really placing a burden on their employees of color, their employees at diverse intersections, and really expecting those employees to have answers on how to fix a system that those employees did not design and did not ask for. And so when we really think about this, we realize that it can be a catch-22 because we're limiting a little bit where we're getting information, but at the same time, we're really encouraging you to do your own research, do your own homework, and we'll give you tips on how to do that before and instead of asking someone to take the time to share their own trauma and their own experiences and also their own education with you.
The most exciting thing that we can think about as we're moving forward within diversity and inclusion is that the future is so diverse and it is only becoming broader and only becoming more welcoming, but we also have to push it along. Now, economic and civic forces are shifting towards diversity and inclusion work. However, there are some pitfalls that we have to make sure that we are remaining cognizant of. Number one, social media. Social media, social media, social media. It's forever nowadays. And as a millennial, I know I was warned as a kid, you know, my parents are like, the internet is forever. And now I get to warn my parents about how the internet is forever. Hypocrisy is easier to point out more than ever today. You don't want to put up, again, like we were saying before, a post that states that you support XYZ individual or XYZ group, and then have those employees or individuals that are working within that system turn around and tell you that you absolutely are not. The internet is very, very democratic, and we want to make sure that people are being really thoughtful in any kind of responses that they're putting online. Next, the oldest members of Gen Z, the generation behind Bethany and I, will be graduating college this year and are entering the workforce in earnest. They are 22, 23, 24 years old. They're adults, and they are exceptionally diverse. 48% of Gen Z is ethnically and racially diverse, and they will be the most educated generation in all of American history. Lastly, COVID-19 and the racial and social movements that we are seeing online, again, are fundamentally shaping Gen Z's worldview. So if we are not also helping them shape what would be an inclusive and diverse future, we're really going to end up doing them a disservice, but more quickly than that, we're going to be doing ourselves a disservice. These are the individuals that are going to be bringing us brilliance and ideas and creativity and intelligence. And if we're not fostering an environment that is holistic and serving them, we're going to be worse for the wear. Next, traditional diversity and inclusion employee resource groups. We've seen them a lot, a women's group or, a Black men's group. It brings together employees with diverse identities within an organization. There are strengths, but there are a couple of limitations with that. The strengths is that you are able to get a feeling of support and camaraderie, especially if you're in an organization where there are not a lot of individuals that either look like you or come from areas like yours. You can get a lot of new, fresh ideas when you are shrinking your workforce and giving individuals the opportunity to kind of brainstorm together. You can also discuss frustration together in a place that can seem non-threatening. And again, going back to that area of support, it really helps us within the workplace. Yet, there are three main limitations that we see with employee resource groups. They're really not empowered to initiate change. If you're getting all diverse people in one room, they don't have any power within the organization. They're not able to just march to the CEO and say anything because, again, they are already marginalized individuals within your group. They could be marginalized within a particular section or a particular department, or just be racially, ethnically, gender-wise marginalized. Next, it's pretty open-ended. That's a great thing, but it's also not that great when you're trying to create specific goals and trying to create strategies that's going to push your organization forward. Lastly, a lot of free labor happens within employee resource groups. They ask individuals to draft policies. They ask individuals to proofread statements. It's a lot of free labor on your Black employees, your employees of color, your women employees, your employees that are lower on the organizational chart.
Now, thinking about traditional D&I training, we also see often unconscious bias training being offered. And while it offers a lot of fantastic strengths, there's a couple of points we think are really important to think about, both when you're thinking about an organization and you're also thinking about your own growth. Unconscious bias training is generally training that discusses the neurology of bias and schema of preference. Generally, it's a one-day training. Sometimes organizations offer it a couple times a year, but a lot of times people are getting an introduction to unconscious bias really in a day-long session. The strengths really are educational discussion of our preferences. We do have neurological bases and processes in place that bias us one way or another. Particularly, we gravitate towards things that we have seen before. It was a matter of survival at one point. It's a great way to get a primer on race and general diversity and how those things interact with each other and how they interact with the human brain in terms of concepts. It also starts generally to explore basics of bias and human thinking, which are really important things to be literate in whenever you're going on a journey, really thinking about changing the way you perceive the world or broadening your perspective. However, there are a couple limitations that we want you to be aware of whenever you're thinking about, if I've participated in unconscious bias training, what more can I do? Or if I've had one in my organization, what next steps can I take? One thing that can be difficult with unconscious bias training is that one-time trainings don't change behavior. And what we mean by that is neurologically, we know that in order to change bias and change the neural pathways in our brain, we need to have repetitive exposure to information that challenges those biases. And that really means it's kind of like exercising a muscle. If you go for a run one day, it's going to be good for you that day. It's going to boost your abilities. But if you don't continue running, if you don't continue working out your muscles, it's not going to change anything in the lifelong scheme of things. And that's essentially what we're saying here with unconscious bias. It operates very similarly neurologically. It's also not offered frequently enough to be in-depth or personal. And what we mean by that is everyone inhabits intersections that interact with our ways of perceiving the world and perceiving our bias. And so for a lot of people, it's important to have time to reflect on our specific biases and the way in which our upbringing and the way in which we've interacted with the world has shaped our worldview. There's also the caveat with unconscious bias training that oftentimes depersonalizes the biases which we have internalized. And by that, I mean, it doesn't really think about accountability or holding ourselves accountable for our actions. So for some people, unconscious bias training someone can walk away essentially saying, well, I may hold biases, but that's how the human brain works, and I'm going to do the best I can with it. That's not really an accountability mindset that is fully committed to changing the ways in which we interact with our biases and others in the world. It can also be very isolating for Black employees and employees of color and people at different intersections because, again, having these conversations can be helpful for learning about biases at intersections that you don't inhabit. However, if they're not offered in a way that really makes a home for Black employees and employees of color who have experienced significant issues around unconscious bias by being victimized by it, can be very uncomfortable, especially inside organizations where you may already have interpersonal issues that have not been fully resolved. So in some ways, it can solidify resentment if it's not really done in the best possible way.
Right before we grab that next slide, we got a pretty interesting question. So it says, change how the brain works and the problem of bias and the will to have diversity will, let's see, bias and want of diversity will go away. So I think what—
To a certain—
Yes, okay.
Sorry, I see brain questions and I just get so excited.
I love them. I don't want to skip over them.
Really, the way that our brain works is our neurological pathways are hardwired to be as efficient as possible. And what that means is that over our lives, our brain strengthens connections between neurons that we access together very often. So it's kind of like a river, right? We have neurons that continue to flow and are accessed and flow along those channels very often. And the longer that it flows, the more ingrained that river is going to be. It's going to erode the rock around it and become more part of the landscape. When we're talking about bias, we're really kind of talking about reframing those flows and diverting that river to a new connection, a connection that we want to encourage. And with time, your brain can do that. However, it's important that we're essentially doing this every day, exercising and challenging our biases every single day. There's a lot of different ways to do this. One thing that I like to do is to be sure that I am following and am interacting with content creators. I use social media as a tool for this. I follow creators who inhabit different intersections so that I can be sure that I'm getting perspectives that are not just from my perspective and lived experience. And at the same time, I'm challenging biases and unearthing biases that I have. So thinking a little bit about that, it really is important that we're thinking about this from a neurological perspective, as well as an accountability mindset. We want to pair those two things together. Did I miss anything, Chi-Chi?
No, I think it's perfect. Awesome. So I will do the basic standards training. So as everybody knows, when your boss is like, all right, it's time for your yearly training on harassment or basic legal standards or employee relations, everybody kind of rolls their eyes, they play on their phones. But there are a couple of strengths, but a little bit more weaknesses when we are looking at traditional diversity and inclusion. Some strengths, it gives you a legal basis to make sure that everybody is on the same playing field. There's no, typically there's no wiggle room whenever you're dealing with the kinds of legal requirements that your organization will need to have. It gives protections to employers. I know we're very, very employee focused as an employee resource and employee advocacy firm, but these legal standards do protect your employers, especially from frivolous lawsuits or harassing clientele. It really helps you protect yourself in that kind of way. It also allows employees to raise basic issues with each other in a non-threatening way. So it's whatever the standard is, you are able to raise those basic issues. Some limitations with these really basic standards training is that many of them have not changed since 1980, specifically sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace. I went to a harassment training when I was still working at an organization, and it was, oh gosh, the most uncomfortable experience ever. They did not mention digital harassment. They did not mention the fact that people can be harassed utilizing different methods. It was very, very basic, and it wasn't really gerund to how we're living life today. It really does not, again, like the second point states, it doesn't really modify any kind of current or persistent behavior. If something keeps happening over and over again, these basic standards trainings only happen once or twice a year. So it's not really addressing that kind of harassment that may be happening day to day. These standards tend to be the absolute minimum. When you're talking about racial harassment, you know, you're waiting for someone to say that horrible word, as opposed to different ways that people are able to marginalize racial and ethnic minorities. And lastly, it doesn't address microaggressions. It doesn't address the way that individuals are able to needle each other in the workplace in ways that are based on their identities in negative ways. Surveys.
So thinking a little bit about surveys, we are looking at employee surveys that request feedback from employees and stakeholders. This is often using anonymous feedback models. These can be very helpful for gathering qualitative and quantitative feedback from your employees and providing a resource to employees as well as a voice. It's a great platform to take a temperature check of how people are feeling inside of your organization. It's a great way to surface new solutions that your organizational employees may have. It can be a really, really useful tool. However, we often see surveys utilized inside a vacuum. And what we mean by that is a lot of times we see standalone employee surveys where organizations are interested in understanding what's going on with their employees. However, they're not reporting back out what comes out of that survey, or it's not part of a larger plan to initiate change. It can be really useful for identifying problems, but not really solutions if you're not really asking questions that are tailored at particular solutions or ideas. It's also very helpful to have it inside of a larger plan so that employees can understand exactly how their data is going to be utilized so that they can give you feedback that is the most useful. Identifying for Black employees and employees of color can be used to retaliate. We also have seen organizations that really seek to identify people who make comments that are somewhat incendiary. And so a lot of organizations have a problem with trust between employees and surveys because there have been times inside organizations, particularly organizations that have been around for some time, where employees really have a distrust that they might be identified through the story that they share. They might also be a part of an easily identifiable group. So say, you ask people what department they're working in, and say there's only 6 people in that department, it gets relatively easy to start figuring out whose voice sounds like whose, and you can kind of pinpoint where recommendations or critiques are coming from, and that can be problematic. And so something that we do suggest here is having a third party really look at your surveys and house all of that data so that employees have another layer of protection, and it helps reinforce that honest conversation that is imperative in an employee survey. We can't utilize data if data is not honestly aggregated and feedback is not open.
So new interventions. Bethany just gave us the example of utilizing a third-party investigator. This is really, really great to do when you are trying to build a new strategy for your organization. So it's building upon the work that your employees have already done, but it also offers an opportunity to fully explore ideas from your organization that allows you to create a little bit more space within the process. Again, you don't want to identify individuals who are identifying areas of growth in your organization, especially if it's leadership going down to staff or vice versa, staff to leadership. It just gives you a little bit of space.
Great. And building upon that, we really think about individual coaching and personal responsibility as part of this process. Chi-Chi and I recognize that no policy, no procedure, no training is going to have the impact that we need it to have if the people administrating those things are not committed to and educated in exactly what we're trying to achieve. And so we really do base a lot of our work in personal accountability, personal growth, personal learning, because we really see huge impacts whenever people understand the why behind a policy. We also use a model where we really do impart modeling behaviors to management and upper level leadership. And we really want leadership to understand very intimately the why behind particular choices and policy decisions, so that they can be modeling the type of behavior that we want to see inside an organization that is very, very, very inclusive. We really do like to also have the opportunity for leadership and people who maybe lead teams to have a private space to ask questions. And what I really mean by that is there's a lot of basic components to this work and to the conversations that we have where people have questions. They're not entirely educated. This might be new territory for them. And so they might have questions about history. They might have questions about definitions. They might have very basic questions. And we like to have those conversations in a private space where leadership can really ask every single thing that they need to ask in order to fully understand the rationale behind a lot of the decisions we recommend inside organizations. It really supports people in modeling behavior by having a space to process their particular questions and their particular interactions with different identities. We really see a lot of people needing space to really process the way in which they see the world. Not all biases function in the same way, and the way in which you have been brought up and the way and the intersections that you inhabit are going to have an effect on how you view the world and how you interact with people at different intersections. And so having that private space, having coaching to discuss those pieces really allows you to take a personalized look at your interaction with diversity and inclusion and provides a basis for moving forward as a leader and modeling the type of behavior that we want to see.
Awesome. My favorite, policy and document review. When you have third parties come into your organization, those organizations, those firms are able to review those existing documents and policies and really kind of get into the nitty-gritty without having that kind of investment within the organization, and try to see if these policies are still relevant to the types of employees that you have currently or where you would like to progress as an organization. It's a very comprehensive approach that really integrates the work product of your organization along with the historical background of where your organization has been. Policy and document review also leads to really highly fine-tuned, customized solutions that, again, fit within your existing structure. You don't wear the same shoes that you wore when you were a child. So why do you use the same solutions that you used 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Your workforce has changed. The world has changed. Current events is always evolving. So we want to make sure that those ideas, those policies that are ever changing, or the ideas outside of the walls that are ever changing, are reflected within the policies that you are promoting within your organization. Lastly, it analyzes these existing policies to try to make sure that you are not inconsistently either promoting these policies or inconsistently implementing these policies for your employees or for consumers of whatever product or service you're putting out into the world.
So the importance of policy and document review cannot be overstated. It really is about leveraging the expertise of your team, lifting up voices and relieving pressure. And when I think about this, I really do think about the importance of having expertise in these areas. A lot of organizations, I think, are taking their first steps towards diversity and inclusion work. And like we mentioned before, they're relying a lot on the lived experiences of the employees that they have. And while that can be a place to start, it's important that we are engaging with and investing in really creating new solutions from a place of expertise. The reason that policy and document review can be so helpful is because it really does build upon your particular culture and your particular organization, and allows organizations to really build upon those policies that already exist, those processes that have already been running, and work with the individuals who have helped design and run those processes for a very long time. It's talking about, moving or modifying existing processes rather than creating them from the ground up. It also lifts up the voices of Black and minority team members, because instead of placing a responsibility on team members to be responsible for fixing a system that marginalizes them, instead your marginalized employees are brought solutions and are able to put in input into that process rather than being asked to do all of the heavy lifting without any particular expertise. What we're seeing a lot of is organizations asking people who have particular intersections but not particular training to solve problems that they are not trained to solve, just on their lived experience and one perspective. And what we're essentially saying is, if you have Bob in accounting who is a Black man, he may not be interested in or fully equipped to answer the questions that you might have about how to intervene inside organizations and create organizational change in a positive direction. Another benefit here is that it really relieves pressure on leadership to come up with solutions in a vacuum. A lot of times what we see as well is leadership feeling a bit overwhelmed by the amount of information and the amount of literacy that they need to get up on in order to create solutions inside their organization. And it can be very, very high pressure because there is a lot of external pressure and conversation and controversy outside of our organizations. And so for leaders who have not particularly been invested in this work in the past or have not been exposed to this work in the past, that can be a really, really precarious position. Whereas whenever you're bringing people in who are able to process things with you, educate you on what you need to know, and then also create solutions for you, you really are getting a holistic perspective and relieving a lot of that high stress, high pressure component there and taking steps that really empower everyone in your organization, leadership included.
So customized and recurring training is necessary. When you curate conversations, when you curate trainings based on the size of your organization and the needs of your organization, you're going to be able to be rapidly responsive to any kind of crisis that may occur. Here's an example. Right before COVID, we would talk to organizations about being a little bit more flexible about their work from home policies, right? Many organizations would be like, oh my gosh, Chi-Chi, you guys are just like hippie, liberal, millennials. This is ridiculous. Everybody has to be in the office to be able to do work. Like there's no reason why individuals cannot be here from 8:30 until 5:30 every single day. And what Bethany and I said is, well, the workforce is rapidly changing and there's no need necessarily for certain organizations to have their employees looking at each other every single day for them to maintain the same level of productivity and efficiency. What COVID has laid bare is the opportunity for work to change, for 21st century work to look a little bit more flexible, to look a little bit more responsive to whatever is happening in current events, but also more responsive to the needs of each and every employee. And many of those organizations have come back and said, oh, we wish we had a system in place because now we're kind of crazy. Now we're running around trying to build systems when you could have done that kind of system building proactively. Next, that kind of recurring training, just like we were talking about before, maintaining brain elasticity, allows us to really make sure that we are stretching ourselves and making sure that we are allowing ourselves to understand new concepts and exercising our brain just like any kind of muscle that we use in our physical body. Lastly, that kind of recurring training allows us to have a platform for in-depth conversations about the wider lens of diversity. Again, earlier in our presentation, we talked about how many times diversity and inclusion is really just looked at as a Black or an African American issue and a white American issue. And I'm here to tell you that diversity is even more diverse than that. We are talking about neurological diversity. We're talking about gender and sexual expression diversity. We're talking about regional diversity, class diversity. All kinds of diversity should be welcomed within the workplace, but we have to have a platform where individuals, again, are able to exercise and be exposed to different types of diversity so that we're not really curtailing ourselves into just thinking that only Black and white diversity are the things that matter. They're not. We just need to make sure that we are embracing wider themes that are way more inclusive for how inclusive our world has the opportunity to be.
Absolutely. So just to build upon that, in terms of questions you might have, we'd like to open up the floor. So I will stop sharing here in a second. We'd love to hear from you. We also are always open to hear from you after our conversation here. So you can always email us at hello@enlighten-solutions.com. You'll get Chi-Chi and I. And you can also become a member at Enlighten Solutions, where we are putting together training and online courses, really looking at getting people up to speed on some of these interventions that we've talked about and some of the history and perspectives that we've talked about as well. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to open it up to Natalie.
Well, thank you both so much for the presentation. It was amazing. So obviously, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just type them into the chat box and we will definitely try to answer those for you. Now, in the presentation, you had, of course, touched on current events. And of course, we've been going through a lot in our country, from police brutality to the pandemic, and that's led to increased conversations around race and racism, both personally and professionally, especially with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I would ask, in your work, what kinds of challenges do you see nonprofits facing here in Greater Cleveland specifically?
Oh, that's a great question. If I'm getting this correct, you said, what are the challenges that we are seeing within the nonprofit sphere within Cleveland here?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think the first, I wouldn't say challenge, but I would say a hurdle or an opportunity for growth is fatigue. We had a lot of momentum earlier this year, when COVID started, let's just say in March, when individuals really, especially here in Cleveland, rallied around each other. You know, we checked in on our neighbors, we talked to our family members, we told everybody to mask up and get together separately and make sure that everybody was remaining safe and that our workplaces were supporting us. But now, as we traverse throughout the spring and the summer, and now that we're entering fall, as it's getting really dark outside, as it's getting gloomy, the fatigue has set in. So whether it's the fatigue of the racial reckoning that was happening in the summer, a lot of the protests, a lot of the real areas of growth that within policing or within government was happening, a lot of the movement that was happening, people are now really tired of it. And we can see that in any kind of poll. So there was a recent poll that talked about, you know, individual support of these protests. It's waned as we've gone through. What I like to say is that this is a marathon. We cannot get fatigued when we are thinking and trying to explore real structural changes. So if we're just looking at the workplace, right, we can't get fatigued and go back to the way that work was before the pandemic. It won't work. It's not anything. We have seen how work has changed. So now we get the opportunity to build upon a new, more inclusive, more resilient, more flexible working situation for all Americans, as opposed to just becoming complacent and resting on our laurels and pretending like we'll go back to how work was in 2019 and before. It won't work. Our brains don't work that way. So I think just for me, the biggest area of growth is fatigue, and knowing that we don't have to do everything all at once, but we can chip away at some of the more destructive systems day by day to make our world a little bit better here in Cleveland.
Thank you, Chichi.
Yeah, just to build off of that a little bit, I mean, I think that is definitely something that we've been seeing in conversations we've been having, and we're all feeling a little bit fatigued in our personal lives, I think, and then in our professional lives as well. Another component I think that's important to think about is our Midwestern sensibilities. And by that, I mean, I'm a lifetime Midwesterner. I love it here. I have a sticker that says OPE. I'm a big fan, but I think that we do have a kind of conservatism here, not necessarily referring to a political conservatism, but to a conservatism where we can be somewhat resistant to change. And we don't always see ourselves as innovators. And one thing that I really want to encourage people here to think about today is Cleveland has the opportunity, more opportunity than anyone else in the nation, to make huge strides here. And by that, I mean, a lot of the statistics that we all kind of are frustrated with. We were just ranked the most impoverished large city in America. We're even lower than Detroit at this point. We also have seen statistics. Chichi and I rely heavily on a particular study that ranked Cleveland as the worst place in America for Black women to live, work, and receive an education. And so what I really want us to think about is that positioning allows us such an opportunity to solve problems that are plaguing our country today. And so what I really want people to think about is this is the time and this is the place to be radical about this work in order to start innovating in a way that can really position us well regionally in the future. When we're really thinking about the generation coming behind us, and we're thinking about what they're demanding and what they're looking for, imagine if we could turn Cleveland into a place that turned that around 100%, and now we're very inclusive. And now we're a place that you come to be a diverse person, because we are a very diverse city, and we have not capitalized on that in the way that we should, and we have not facilitated the richness of our city and our experiences and our perspective in a way that really could put us ahead of the curve in a way that I don't think we've seen in a very long time.
Thank you, Bethany. So, does anyone in the audience have any questions? Not seeing anything in the chat.
Don't be shy. We love answering questions, and we're very frank people, trust me.
I'll talk all day. I will. If you don't ask a question, I'll just pick something and I'll talk.
Since I'm not seeing anything there from any of the attendees, I would ask, what are sort of next steps for the two of you with your organization?
Well, currently, we're in the process of a research project, a phenomenological research project. Really big, long word that just describes lived experiences, the lived experiences of Black women in Cleveland. So Bethany brought up the statistic in the recent report that ranked Cleveland as the poorest big city in America. Cleveland also has the negative distinction of being the worst city in America for Black women. And this is not something we made up. This is something that we have seen some research out of the University of Pittsburgh that Cleveland has ranked the lowest for Black women in the areas of healthcare, education, and workplace. And the study has been controlled for all cities that have more than 100,000 Black women residing within the city. So very comprehensive survey, very comprehensive research. And what's next for us is that earlier in August throughout September, we put out a survey for Black women in Cleveland to take about just their experiences living, working, and receiving healthcare within the city. We've aggregated those responses, and now we're going through and peeling back those layers of data. Bethany is our policy wonk. She is amazing at this. So right now we're kind of hunkering down and making sure that as we are peeling through these layers of data, that when we write our 2 reports, one for Black women and one for organizations here in Cleveland, that we're providing really holistic resources, details, ideas, and vignettes of Black women's experiences here in Cleveland. So if you guys stay tuned to Work Enlightened on all social media platforms, or just send us an email, we're definitely going to have a report coming out in early 2021, and more experiences and more opportunities to talk about it right before we put out our report throughout late fall and the beginning of winter of this year. So look out for Project Noir. That is our project on Black women here in Cleveland.
That sounds amazing and incredibly ambitious.
That's us.
but definitely necessary. I think we have a question.
See a question here.
Oh,
Yeah. I think that's a great point. You know, we would really love to see, you know, Chi-Chi and I would love to see greater investment in this work. And kind of what you're talking about here is a prioritization that, you know, that government incentivized. We'd love to see that type of work and that type of conversation happening at the level of diversity and inclusion. Chi-Chi and I are often somewhat frustrated with the hesitation of organizations to invest in this work. There's a friend of mine who always says, budgets are moral documents. If you want to know how an organization values particular pieces of their organization or what they value, you look at their budget. And what we really do see locally is, and nationally as well, we see a hesitation in investing in transformative work. We continue to get pressure to do things like one-off trainings, you know, one little thing here or there. And I understand, you know, organizations are looking at cost control. We're in a difficult economy right now. However, at the same term, one-off trainings, one employee survey, one conversation, one book club, one resource group is not going to change your organization. It's simply not. Humans don't operate that way. Organizations don't operate that way. And in order to do really transformational work where you're actually going to see changes in your metrics, that you're actually going to see changes on the ground level of your organization, we do have to invest in this work in a monetary way. It can be frustrating because the work that Chi-Chi and I do, we love and are very passionate about, and we do it because we have both a moral calling and a dedication to this. But at the same time, we live in a capitalist system. I have to pay my mortgage. And so we have to balance our time to ensure that we are doing the best that we can in terms of working with organizations that really want to make transformative change, because that's what we're here for. Chi-Chi and I are not here to take a picture and post it to Instagram and support kind of that performativeness. We're really here to we're really here to change systems, to turn them on their head and to start over again. And what really does come out of it is employers and organizations are much better off for that work. Every piece of data shows that they are more resistant to economic downturns, that they are better at making decisions, that they are better at seeing the future, that they are able to capitalize on opportunity at a rate that is much higher than organizations that don't invest in this work. So both the metrics and the policies behind us, however, we see kind of a slow investment here in our region, and we're really hoping to see that move forward.
We had a quick comment at the end. I know we're out of time, but I do want to put forth the idea of like, how do you incentivize something like this? Just like we talked about with Project Noir and Black women here in Cleveland, although it's great to make the moral argument of we should be living in an anti-racist city and that we should be having you know, diversity and inclusion everywhere, if you want to be even more cynical about it, this region economically is not going to do well if one portion of that society, one portion, decides to end up and leave. So out of that survey, or out of that research from CityLab Bloomberg that talks about how Cleveland is the worst city for Black women, the best cities for Black women are cities that Black women are moving to at a rapid rate. Those are cities like Charlotte, North Carolina. Those are Atlanta, even Baltimore. Boston was ranked really, really high. So women of means, women that have that kind of education and that upward mobility, will end up leaving and will be taking their brilliance, their capital, their intelligence out of the city as well. And where Black women are leaving, other women will end up leaving as well. Then you are going to start dealing with a cyclical brain drain here in the city. You're going to end up having a city that's going to be dying economically because, again, the tax base is leaving, your innovation is leaving, individuals are leaving a city. And what we don't want, what I don't want as a first-generation American whose parents came to Cleveland for opportunity, is for this region that gave me culture and language and purpose to end up dying out in the only 32 years that I've been on this earth. So if you want to look at it more cynically, there is an economic factor to making sure that diversity and inclusion takes root here in this city.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. So we are out of time for today. I just, again, want to thank Chi-Chi and Bethany from Enlightened Solutions for joining us. This was an excellent presentation. And thank you to all of our attendees. Again, if you have any questions, what was the email address again?
It's hello@enlightened-solutions.com. You can also go onto our website and our contact information is right there as well. So it's just enlightened-solutions.com.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.